Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Patrick Terry, and I'm the CEO at the Columbus Council on World Affairs. It's a delight to have you each here today. Please continue to eat. That's the whole idea. We're doing two things at once, eating and listening. I know you can do it. Before we start with today's program, there's some people we want to thank, particularly our mission partners, and if they could raise their hands, if they're represented here, and then also we can give them a round of applause at the end. Abbott Nutrition, Battelle, Cardinal Health, CVG, Greif, Honda, Ebel Agency, Kegler Brown, and Nationwide. Please join me in thanking these mission partners. Let me also, Shannon, would you wave your hand? Shannon doesn't get to be thanked very often. She's back there. Keep waving. Shannon puts on all these programs and deserves a great round of applause. All right, is Susan Rosenberg and John Bodell in the room? If you are, raise your hand. Awesome. Newest individual members right here, right now. These folks, go ahead and give them a round of applause. Through the foundation, corporate, and individual support, it's programs like this that happen. We've got one coming up next month on, stomping out poverty through social entrepreneurship. We have the ambassador from Singapore coming. Singapore always is top of the list on education charts. Their students score the best, and we're going to try to figure out why. And then June 11th, we have a former ambassador from Israel and from Egypt talking about shifting sands in the Middle East. So it's these programs that your support make happen. And every day we're working with high school students around this region to help bring them global fluency. We do it through the Global Scholars Diploma, which is a credential that a student could earn after 3 years in high school that goes on their diploma. They get a core at graduation. It's on the transcript for the colleges to see, and they bring it with them on their resume to demonstrate to employers the success they've had in global skills and experiences. Next month, actually in 2 weeks, we'll be at Battelle talking with some of the global career folks there to help expose these students to what they can be doing locally, but on a global impact. The format for today is similar to those in the past. We'll have a keynote followed by a Q&A session with me and the speaker. There are no cards at your table. You can tweet hashtag AskCCWA at any time, and we'll feed questions that way. We're always thankful that we live stream around the country through our partner organizations in more than 90 cities around the country, the World Affairs Councils of America. Today is sponsored in particular by our friends at The Ohio State University, specifically at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, and these following co-sponsors at the Department of Political Science, the John Glenn School of Public Affairs, East Asian Studies Center, Institute for Korean Studies, and the Institute for Japanese Studies. Now, please join me in welcoming the representative from this coalition, Dr. Craig Jenkins, who directs the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University.
Thank you much. We have a very distinguished speaker here today who I'll put a plug in is talking tomorrow. So if you didn't get enough today, come over to Mershon Center tomorrow. But anyway, it'll be a different talk. So Dr. Henry Nau is a recognized foreign policy expert. He's served on President Reagan's National Security Council as a senior staff member responsible for international economic affairs. Among other duties, he was the White House Sherpa for the annual G7 economic summits in Ottawa, Versailles, Williamsburg, and a special summit with developing countries in Cancun. Henry Nau served as special assistant to the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the Department of State from 1975 to 77, and in 1977 he received the State Department Superior Honor Award. Today, Dr. Nau is Professor of Political Science, International Affairs at George Washington University, and he is the author of Conservative Internationalism, which you can learn more about from a flyer that was someplace out there at the registration table. And I think there's a copy of the book around, too. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Henry Nau.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a real delight to be with you, and thank you for inviting me. You know, when we leave Washington, we always say it's great to be back in America. I'm also reminded as a college professor that when I speak to audiences outside of the university, I should remember the very wise words of President Eisenhower. He used to say about academics who would come in and advise him the following. He said, oh, yes, those are those guys and gals who come in and who use a lot of words and take a long time to tell you more than they know. So with that qualification on what we do as professors, let me start with a puzzle that I think is really genuinely intended. And the puzzle is the following. I don't think any president has tried harder than President Obama has to avoid wars. First to end wars, and then to avoid wars. But at least by some readings, you can say he has not succeeded. We are back at war in Iraq. The war in Syria goes on. Chaos and war continues in Libya. We have increasing conflict around the entire border of Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon is in a stronger position than ever before. And most recently, war has broken out again in Yemen. So the question is, why does this happen? Why does it happen that war breaks out even when we do everything we can? And remember President Obama's pledge to open up his hand to the Muslim world, to Russia, to China, to all of those countries that were alleged adversaries, his willingness to try to work with them, his withdrawal of American forces from some of the trouble spots, especially from Iraq. And despite all that, wars have continued and wars have increased. Now, I want to argue that part of the problem that we have is that we tend to think about international relations in only one of two ways. Either that we can go out and transform the world, as George W. Bush did, or thought he did, after 9/11. That is, that somehow or other we can not only defeat threats like the Taliban government in Afghanistan, but we can also build nations and promote democracy. Almost anywhere. In his second inaugural, he said, we will end tyranny in every nation and in every culture. So we have this tendency to think that somehow or other we can engage the world in a way that will transform it, take care of threat and lead other countries to adopt democracy, and that's not going to cost us a lot. We'll be able to do that largely through effective diplomacy. In fact, of course, it winds up costing us an awful lot because it's a very ambitious thing to think, a very ambitious way to go, that somehow or other we can transform other countries and can increase the number of countries in the world that are democratic. It's an extremely ambitious. Think of Woodrow Wilson when he first kind of invented this idea. Extraordinarily ambitious. How do we think we're going to accomplish that without a lot of cost? Well, eventually the costs mount, as they did under George W. Bush, and we decide we've had enough of that approach to trying to deal with our problems in the world, and we resolve upon retreating. We resolve upon withdrawing. We resolve upon coming back home, taking care of ourselves, and assuming that others will step up and take care of themselves. Now, this is a traditional way of thinking about American politics. It's associated with so-called nationalists and realists. Let me put my slides up here, although I've been warned that they are too theoretical, so we may not want to pay that much attention to them. And I don't know how to, there we are. Okay. But this approach of kind of retreating, coming home, just taking care of ourselves, not worrying about others, all right, not getting out of all of these entanglements that are beginning to cost us so dearly, as in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. That tradition is associated with nationalism and realism in American political thought, and it goes back to Andrew Jackson and Teddy Roosevelt, and more recently people like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. By the way, nationalist thinking today and realist thinking is on the rebound because we're in a mood to pull back. We're in a mood to get out of all of these entanglements with all of the costs that we have incurred, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so in the debate today, you find this position being taken by very prominent people. Rand Paul. Rand Paul is a classic American nationalist who has declared sort of that we ought to finally come home, bring our troops home from Europe and from Asia. It's long past time that they take care of themselves. They can. They're big. They're strong. They're democratic. Let them take care of their own security. We should come home and focus on our security. He follows a long line of people like Pat Buchanan and, of course, all the way back to Andrew Jackson, who have kind of taken this position. Defend America and don't worry about the rest of the world. The rest of the world will take care of itself. Now, the realist position also, by the way, is fairly prominent today. The realist is a little bit more ambitious than the nationalist, wants to take care of America, but in the process of taking care of America also wants to make sure that threats don't emerge in other parts of the world. And so the realist, like Henry Kissinger, is interested in making alignments with other countries in order to prevent a single country from becoming dominant anywhere else in the world, because that's a prelude to their attacking us in this part of the world. So realists are a little bit more ambitious in terms of trying to deal with threat, but they're still focused primarily on just defending America and, if possible, staying in this hemisphere. All right, focusing on military strength. Rand Paul recently has been talking a lot about that, maintain our military strength, but he says for the purpose of peace, not war. That is, for the purpose of peace, not freedom. He's not emphasizing the need, as does the other position that I just mentioned, the liberal, what we call the liberal internationalist position. He does not believe that we should, in fact, expand freedom. We should be engaged in defending and expanding freedom around the world. Peace is good enough for realists. And by the way, in a nuclear world, not a bad objective. All right, all of these positions have a logic to them, by the way. These two ways that we think about the world, the nationalist realist way and the liberal internationalist way, are very logical. They have a lot of antecedents in history, and they're reasonable in terms of the debate. The problem is they cause us to cycle back and forth. All right, we try, in the case right after World War I, we try to set up the League of Nations. Doesn't work, we come home. All right, after World War II, we set up the United Nations. It's going to take care of the world. Diplomacy is going to be able to manage all of our problems. Doesn't work, we get involved in the Berlin blockade and then ultimately in NATO. After Vietnam, we thought we could come home. We were tired of that war, like we're tired of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan today. Leave them alone. Let them determine their own fate, and we'll take care of ourselves, and they'll take care of themselves. But what happened? Iran, of course, took our hostages. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Soviet Union actually took over parts of Vietnam, that is, set up a naval base in Cam Ranh Bay. And before you know it, we were right back into a Cold War with the Soviet Union. So these times of retreat, when we pull back from the costs of trying to transform the world, they are never safe for very long. Eventually, some new threat emerges. And I would almost guarantee, even though I don't like to say this, I mean, obviously, this is a terrible thing to say, but I worry, let me put it that way, that the current retreat that we are engaged in is going to be followed at some point in some time by another major disaster of some sort. If not a 9/11, then an Iranian hostage event. Certainly, we hope not a Pearl Harbor, which is what eventually ended our isolationism in the 1930s. And because I worry about that, I want to try to find another way to think about how we can stay in the world at acceptable cost, all right, over a sustainable period of time. How can we stop this cycling back and forth? So that was the idea behind thinking through another alternative, another way of approaching American foreign policy, an approach that's been used in the past, but it hasn't been articulated as fully in the academic world, and it hasn't been represented as robustly in our debates about foreign policy, such as the one we're having today. So what might be an alternative between this tendency, which is dominant at the moment, to come home, take care of ourselves, be strong militarily, but don't worry about the rest of the world, and the alternative approach, which was let's go overseas and try to make other countries better, as Woodrow Wilson put it, let's teach them how to elect good men, how to build good governments, all right, how to promote democracy, knowing full well that that's an approach that at some point is going to get us very entangled in the world and it's going to be very costly. How do we find something in between? Well, that's this alternative that I have tried to sketch out in my latest book called Conservative Internationalism. All right, and let me kind of talk about that briefly in terms of 5 points about what conservative internationalism is and how it differs, all right, from these 2 dominant sort of approaches that are currently featured in the debate. The withdrawal sort of option emphasized by nationalists and realists, and the engagement option emphasized by the liberal internationalists. I should maybe say a word more about the liberal internationalists. Obama obviously has extended the open hand to the world through diplomacy and believes very strongly in approaching all problems through diplomacy. But he also believes, as liberal internationalists historically have believed, I'm thinking now Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, that you don't use force against countries while you're negotiating with them. All right? You don't apply any military pressure to Iran while you're negotiating with them, because you will only aggravate them, make them mad, and you will increase distrust. You're trying, obviously, to negotiate, so you want to increase trust. The way to do that is not to maneuver military forces, but it's rather to sit at the table, let them know that military options may be a last resort, all right, but you don't want to take any actions while the negotiations are going on. You want to rely on the ability to persuade the other person, and maybe you want to rely on economic sanctions as the best way to get their attention, right? But you keep military leverage off the table, more or less. Now, Obama's done that. He has, as I mentioned before, taken military U.S. troops out of Iraq. He's not engaged American military forces in Syria. He has repositioned American naval assets from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. So he has practiced the diplomacy with arms as a last resort, or military leverage as a last resort. Now, we'll see in a minute that works as long as your adversary is also not using force except as a last resort. But not all of your adversaries are going to behave that way, and in some case, Iran has not behaved that way. So let me explain these 5 points and come back to this point when I speak about armed diplomacy. What's conservative? What do we mean by conservative? Well, what we mean is that we don't aim for as much in trying to transform the world as does liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism has this objective of building centralized institutions, all right, that manage the world peacefully, like the League of Nations, like the United Nations. Conservative internationalism would say, look, that's not very realistic. You're not going to make much progress if you try to always solve problems with unanimity in a world as complex as ours, with 200 nations or so. So we don't have to be concerned about building international institutions. What we should be concerned about is simply helping other countries to become free, drawing upon their own traditions of freedom, their own traditions of liberalism, but let them remain independent, let them retain their national sovereignty, let them retain their national arms. And the conservative objective would be a kind of democratic peace, a world in which more and more countries were democracies, but lived side by side had their own arms, managed their own defenses, but lived side by side increasingly in peace. Because we know from a lot of work done in political science and international affairs that democracies, in fact, do not fight against one another. Now, so that's one. In that sense, conservative internationalism is less ambitious than liberal internationalism. We don't have to build the United Nations or the League of Nations. We can live with a world in which countries are separate and sovereign. But conservative internationalism is also internationalist. And by internationalist, I mean it does believe, like liberal internationalists, like Mr. Obama, that it would be helpful if other countries became more free, if they became more democratic. And therefore, there is a desire to continue to not only defend freedom, but to expand freedom in the world. Now, the president I worked for was extremely clear about this. He differed always from the realists like Henry Kissinger because he believed that we were not consigned to live in a world in which we had to coexist with the Soviet Union indefinitely. That in the end, freedom would win, and freedom would win sooner rather than later if we concentrated on how to project the advantages of freedom. He thought that we were not only a place, a territory, a piece of geography, but that we were also an idea, and that idea, we had to represent that idea in the world. After all, we bring the world to us, and we create a liberal democracy here. 50% of our people will be non-white in a few years. Why is it that democracy is not appropriate to peoples everywhere else? These same people who come here and become democratic could be democratic at home. So he valued the idea of America and said we need to be concerned about, helping and doing whatever we can to be on the side of dissidents around the world. Now, realists and nationalists who are in sort of control at the moment don't think that that's either realistic or possible, and worry that it's going to complicate efforts to simply manage peace in the world and get along in the world. You're going to make it more difficult. And in a nuclear world, why make it more difficult? By trying to help the spread of freedom around the world. That's a very good debate that we have all the time. I suspect we could poll this room and 50% of us would be one way and 50% the other way. But conservative internationalism as an option in the debate would say, no, you've got to be concerned about freedom abroad. When you're concerned about freedom abroad, you do a better job of freedom at home. Think about what we accomplished in this country in the area of civil rights while we were the champion of freedom in the Cold War abroad. So freedom, in some sense, at home and abroad go together for the conservative internationalists. Now, if we're going to be serious about defending and spreading freedom, we're going to encounter pushback from the non-democracies. There's no doubt about that. They're not going to be very happy about your desire to to defend and expand the borders of freedom. Think about Mr. Putin today. He's worried about liberal democracy moving into Ukraine. Think about Mr. Xi. He's worried about liberal democracy in the Western, in the Asian Pacific region. He talks all the time about American and Western liberal hegemony in the region. He's not very comfortable with democracy moving closer and closer. I don't blame them. I wouldn't be either if I were an autocrat. All right, just as we fear, obviously, when autocracy moves closer to us. So there's a natural antagonism that's going to emerge, all right, between non-democracies and democracies. If you're going to negotiate effectively with them in order to defend and possibly spread freedom, you're going to have to arm your diplomacy. That's what this third point means. That means that, look, you're facing countries that use arms and force regularly in their domestic affairs. That's how they maintain their power. What does Mr. Putin do with his opponents in Russia? He puts them in prison, he exiles them, or he kills them. Pretty simple. What does Mr. Xi do? He conducts a big campaign against corruption, and in the process eliminates all of his potential competitors. These countries are going to use force domestically to stay in power, and they're going to be more inclined, as our political science research tells us, to use force internationally. So if we don't find a way to stop them from achieving their objectives internationally by force, why would they want to negotiate with us? Now think about the situation in Iran. Iran has been, for the last 4 years while we've been negotiating, has been using force while we have not been using force, deliberately we have said force is a last resort, but not in the case of Iran. Iran's been marching steadily ahead in terms of developing its threshold nuclear weapons capability. It started with something like 100 centrifuges. It's now got over almost 20,000 centrifuges. It's continued to apply, it's used force to gain greater influence in Iraq. As soon as we pulled out, who stepped in? Iran stepped in. The Revolutionary Guard is actually there in Baghdad. It was leading for a while the forces that were fighting the ISIS groups around Tikrit. He has escalated his support. Iran at least has escalated its support for Assad in Syria, has clearly not backed off from its support of Hezbollah and Hamas on the borders of Israel, and now is supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Steadily, Iran has been expanding its influence through military activity in the region while it's been negotiating. It didn't say, oh, we're only going to use force as a last resort. We're the ones who said that. Now, if they can achieve their objectives in this manner of expanding their influence in the region and increasing the pressure on Israel, why would they negotiate with us? Or why wouldn't they negotiate with us forever? All right, knowing full well that we won't use force until those negotiations fail. Well, so far that's what we've been doing. So we've been negotiating forever. And even if we get an agreement, given the relationship of the forces on the ground, that agreement's likely to favor Iran more than it will favor us. And of course, some of the criticism of Obama has indicated how, in fact, the Iranians have more now of what they wanted, and we have less of what we wanted. Originally, Obama said we were going to stop the nuclear program altogether. Well, that's clearly not being done by this framework agreement. So what would that mean? It would mean that we should have pushed back against these efforts by Iran to achieve their objectives outside negotiations. Particularly, we should have probably taken sides in Syria. Yes, there's some risk to that, but there's risk to not doing it, as I've just suggested. We probably should have left some forces behind in Iraq, and that would have put at least a check on Iranian influence in Iraq. We probably should have reinforced our drone program and our presence in Yemen, which was one of the significant national security programs, according to Obama, because now we've lost it as a result of the Houthi rebellion. Now, those things might have convinced the Iranians that, you know what, we can't gain our objectives outside the negotiations, so let's now see what's the best deal that we can get inside the negotiations. Now, in the question and answer period, I can tell you how Ronald Reagan did this, because he was a genius at it. I mean, we now have a lot of records that are being released from the Reagan years. And Ronald Reagan knew exactly what he was doing from the very beginning with the Soviet Union. He later said, I did it all with malice aforethought. And he followed a policy very similar to the one I'm suggesting. That is, where he made it clear to the Soviets that they weren't going to win an arms race or any other advantage outside the negotiations. Therefore, take the negotiations seriously. And by the way, then I'm going to offer you some things in the negotiations that's in your interest. And so that would also be involved here. We do need to think about what would we offer Iran that could be in Iran's interest. I think in the end they're going to have a civilian nuclear program, and probably with less absolute guarantees than we would like. But we would get a much better agreement had we in fact made it clear to Iran that we were going to resist their effort to shift the balance during negotiations in their favor. Now, we do two things. This is difficult, this is risky, but I'm trying to suggest to you it's also risky doing nothing. That price will come later when we get hit again by some unforeseen event. But we need to discipline this approach. All right, I understand this is using force, and that's dangerous in the world. So I offer, in describing this approach, two ways in which we would discipline the approach. All right, first is we would try to promote democracy in only a relatively few places, not everywhere in the world, as George W. Bush suggested. That is, we would take the problem of trying to expand the borders of freedom seriously only in two places, really, in the world. On the central border in Europe, between the free countries of Europe and Russia, and on the central border in Asia, between the free countries of Asia and China. All right, that would highlight today Ukraine, Turkey, and the Korean Peninsula. If we lose freedom in those three countries, all right, and there's some danger in all three, maybe least in South Korea, but there's some danger in all three that we could lose that freedom over the next 10, 20 years. We will have lost a major battle for freedom, and the border of oppression will move closer to the heart of Europe and to the heart of Japan and our interests in the Pacific. So those countries we need to think about in terms of not only trying to stabilize them, that is, trying to provide some military leverage to balance whatever military leverage the other side may be using, Putin's little green men and separatist equipment forces in Ukraine, but we would also be seeking to, in those countries, to help the democratic forces. We would be seeking in those countries to strengthen the dissidents, to strengthen the elements in those countries that are fighting for freedom. We would not do this in other parts of the world. That is, in other places like Iraq, Afghanistan, earlier Vietnam. We would deal with threats, right, because we were attacked from Afghanistan on 9/11. You have to go after those threats. But we wouldn't stick around to try to build democracy. We have very little going for us. These are countries not on the borders of existing free countries. We don't have a NATO and a European Union or a strong Japan right next door. And so we'd be much more modest in what we would try to achieve in those countries. We'd go in, get rid of the threat, and we'd get out. Had we gotten out of Iraq and Afghanistan within 2 or 3 years, we would have left behind governments no weaker than the ones we're leaving behind today after 10 years. So this is a way to prioritize where the battle for freedom is most important. And I think it's an effective way to limit, this more muscular approach. The fifth and the final point that I will make is the second way in which you discipline this approach, and that is to be ready for compromise. Now, many of Reagan's advisors, his hardest line advisors, never wanted him to negotiate with the Soviet Union. They thought, let's just let the Soviet Union collapse. Let's just let them raise the white flag. I think Reagan knew, and there's some evidence in the record that shows that Reagan understood, then what the hell will we do with the Soviet Union? I mean, let's say they raised the white flag like Germany and Japan did. Who's going to take it over? How are we going to build a nation there? Unconditional surrender means unconditional nation building. Pretty darn expensive. You don't want to do that. So you want to use your military leverage always with the objective of compromising. Now, a compromise in your favor that pushes the other side incrementally and marginally towards freedom. That happened in the case of the Soviet Union, and that worked in the case of the Soviet Union. And so in some of these cases that we're dealing with today, the problem with Russia and Ukraine and the problem with Iran in the Middle East, I think we need to think about what can we offer them? What kind of incentives that are in their interest can be part of the bargain, but a bargain only based on having stalemated their efforts to achieve their objectives outside the negotiations, stalemated by our willingness to use a little bit of force now rather than to wait and use force only after negotiations fail, which, by the way, means always more force. You have to use a lot more force later, and thereby to encourage them to agreements that satisfy them, us, but in the end push the needle of freedom forward, that is, serve our interests more than their interests. Now, this is a different way of, if we thought about our approach in this way, there is a good chance that we could sustain it. That is, we would be engaged in the world continuously with some deployment of forces and some manipulation of forces for the purpose of leverage, but that leverage would be focused on compromises, and it would be focused on only a limited number of important cases, where we would really be concerned about winning the battle for freedom, namely on those borders of existing free countries, as I mentioned, in Europe and Asia. I think it's a way that it's a point of view that at least we ought to be discussing in our debate. And I know it's a difficult one at the moment because everyone is reluctant to think about any kind of foreign policy that involves a use of force. We've been there. We've done that, Professor Nau. We're done. We're finished. But any historical sense will tell us we've done this before, and it works for a little while, but it doesn't work forever. And at some point, we're going to be back in the stew again. And by the way, then we'll have to use a lot more force than we might have to use now. Had we, for example, started arming a small group of opposition people in Syria 3 years ago, we might have actually limited the growth of ISIS, at least in Syria, because the opposition groups with nobody to support them just broke up. Some of them went to al-Nusra, some of them went to ISIS, some of them went to the Syrian army. It's a typical sort of thing that happens when you don't have a oar in the water. You don't have a stake in the conflict. So that should be enough to upset your lunch. Hopefully, it's conceptual thinking about America's approach, but it's not academic thinking about America's approach to the world. All of these points of view are represented in the debate, and in one sense, I suppose my book, I'm hoping, will contribute to a strengthening of a more moderate kind of conservative internationalism, or you could think of it as a more moderate neoconservatism. All right, that may in the end serve us better over the long run than these other approaches which have encouraged this kind of cycling. I don't know if I stayed within my time limit or President Eisenhower's injunction, but that's it. Yeah.
We'll go ahead and have some Q&A from the audience. Feel free to write it on a sheet and just hold it up. One's there with Phyllis, and I see Seaman has one. We're going to get right to it. Before we do, and I'll get mic'd up here and sit next to Dr. Nau. Maybe Dr. Nau, you can talk about this to those of us that are less official, but I noticed in your bio you were a White House Sherpa, and I thought maybe that was just a common term used informally. But is it an actual? What is it? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's an actual term. The Sherpas, are these Nepalese people who help the people climbing Everest and other major summits in the Himalayas. They provide the assistance. They do most of the logistical work and suggest the paths that they should take to the top, etc. So the Sherpas there was one of us in each government that had the responsibility of getting together 6, 8, 10 times during the year, preparing our heads of government for their summit meeting, for their G-Summit meeting, which occurred once a year in those days. In those days, we had a G7. We didn't have a G20. In fact, originally we had a G5, and the G7 was relatively new when I went into the White House. But and this group was rather influential in managing the world economy in that period, and I think had a big role to play in the revival of the world economy, which occurred in the 1980s, based on the revival to a large extent that occurred in the United States and Europe.
And one of my understandings from hearing from trekkers who go to Nepal is that often the Sherpas are wearing flip-flops. Was that the case in this situation or not?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say anything more after these about what we might have done after these Secret Service revelations, whether we met in the swimming pools or not. Right. Sometimes we met in some very nice places. I'm thinking both in this country as well as overseas, and I can barely remember the places because they were, from the moment you landed until the moment you left, you were working.
Well, we hope you get some respite today, and it won't be from the questions, though. Thank you for these. This one has to do with sort of non-state actors. What compromise can you offer non-state, non-nation adversaries like ISIS?
Well, I mean, in the case of groups that are directly threatening us, that's the point I made earlier, you have to go after them. If ISIS is in the process, as I think they are, of doing exactly what the Taliban government did in Afghanistan before 9/11, that is, setting up training camps and training terrorists to attack Europe and potentially the United States, then we have no choice. We have to go after them. Now, my hope is that we find a way to do this without being confronted immediately with having devastated a region or a government and now having to go in and occupy the country and rebuild the government, the experience that we had in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm hopeful that we can do it in a more measured way and not have the objective in those countries of trying to actually promote immediately regime change and democratic systems. I think that's just too impractical. Now, I like, to some extent, some of the things that Obama has done with respect to ISIS. I think we need to be targeting the ISIS threat as we have with drones and with our intelligence capabilities. It is true we can't be as effective as we would like to be without reliable forces on the ground. So that Syrian opposition, had we supported them 3 years ago, they might be there today helping us to direct the attacks against ISIS in Syria. I think we need to encourage, and I like this as part of Obama's foreign policy, we need to encourage the countries in the region to step up. All right, the Kurds, certainly, they did step up, or they are stepping up in some cases, but also maybe some of the Gulf Arab states. I'm not very optimistic that they're ever going to put troops, boots on the ground, for example, in either Iraq or Syria, but they are helping in the bombing program. They are participating in the bombing program. So you try to mobilize a coalition of countries, even if they aren't democratic, because your objective in this part of the world now is to deal with threat, not to build democracies. It's to protect the only democracy that exists in the region, and that's Israel. But you go aggressively after the ISIS threat, but in a way that you can just pull out very quickly. That is, you deal with the threat, and then within a year or two, you're out. Now, that means we need to be thinking about what kind of compromise and what kind of negotiations do we need with Assad? Because once we deal with ISIS, the next problem is Assad. And we had this completely contradictory policy of wanting to replace Assad, but being unwilling to identify anybody that we wanted to replace him with, or to support anybody that we wanted to replace him with. So along with fighting ISIS, we need to be thinking about negotiations with Assad. And by that I mean we need to find a way. He's probably going to stay in power for a while. We need to think in terms of a transition of some sort. And that's a more moderate way, it seems to me, of both dealing with the threat and recognizing that you're going to need a functioning government in that part of the world, unless we want to do it, and we don't want to do it in that part of the world, and then being able to extract ourselves and go maybe back to an offshore posture on our ships in the region.
A follow-on to that I was thinking about as you were talking is are there groups, ISIS, for example, is it organized enough to have that kind of negotiations that you talk a lot about with established nations?
Well, I'm not talking about negotiating with ISIS now. I think you defeat ISIS. I was talking about negotiation with Syria, as a follow-up to what do we hope to see after we've defeated ISIS. No, look.
So ISIS, I guess part of that then is identified enough. We know where ISIS is and how to get the pieces of it that would
Well, they
eliminate
are operating, in some sense, they're the first actual terrorist group that has operated in some sense like a state, and have, of course, even identified themselves as a state of sorts. I mean, they've identified themselves as the caliphate. And the caliphate historically is a territory in which, of course, the more extreme versions of Islam are practiced. So yes, I think we know where they are. We have, obviously, they're different groups. al-Nusra is also a terrorist group in Syria, but from our intelligence, we don't think that they are plotting to attack us or Europe. They're mostly concerned about the region and Israel. So as a result, we've kind of kept, we haven't attacked al-Nusra with the vigor that we have attacked through bombing. That we have attacked ISIS. So yeah, I think non-state actors are a problem clearly, increasingly in the global system, and many people I know, many of my colleagues will argue that that's changed fundamentally the nature of international affairs. Well, it's complicated, certainly the nature of international affairs, and it means that we, as we face more and more of these failed states, we're going to have to deal with more and more of these non-state groups that emerge out of these failed states. But these groups don't represent the kind of existential threat, except maybe very directly in the region, that states do. States are still the major protagonists in international affairs, and this would mean in particular Russia and China.
There are a lot of questions here about Putin, so why don't we switch to the Russia. I'll read them both and maybe you can address them in a combined answer. One is, how can we compromise with Putin on Ukraine? That's one. And the second is, Didn't our push to have the Ukraine join NATO provoke the Russians to be more aggressive with respect to making sure Ukraine did not become part of the West?
Well, let me take the last one first. What provoked Russia? Possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union? Possibility of Ukraine being more democratic? I don't think Ukraine was about to send little green men across the border to seize any territory in Russia, or they certainly weren't beefing up militarily in order to attack Russian territory. When NATO expanded, by the way, because these countries requested that NATO expand, NATO agreed not to put any military forces in these Eastern European countries. No forces, no bases, no logistics, no nothing. We abided by that commitment until Russia invaded Crimea. So what threat does Kiev pose to Russia? If I'm worried about Russia being threatened by freedom, I don't think I'm thinking properly about the world. Now, I don't want to make Russia free overnight. I don't even think Russia's a prospect for freedom in the near term. But I want to be pretty clear about the fact that Putin is not doing what he's doing because he was provoked. He's doing what he's doing because he has a vision of Russia, and he's been very clear about this, and he wants to recreate as much of the old Soviet space as he possibly can. He has a KGB mindset. He has an old Soviet Russian, mindset. And I think we should recognize that. Now, what can we do? How can we compromise with him? Well, I actually do want to compromise with him in the case of Ukraine. If we can stabilize the conflict in Ukraine, that is, make it evident that the separatist forces can't keep expanding because Kiev has got more capability, and possibly work on the ceasefire, get the ceasefire fleshed out a little more, maybe get some international organization people in there to sort of patrol the border, urge the Russians, of course, to pull out some of the equipment. I don't know if they'll do that or not, but if they're facing better equipment on the Kiev side, then maybe the issue can be stabilized. Now, what do we say to the Russians? All right, we give them an off-ramp of sorts, and we promise them we can talk about all kinds of economic activity that we might engage in. We can certainly take off the sanctions that have been imposed, and then we can start talking about positive benefits. Russia's going to need more of this, by the way, if the price of oil stays down, as it is now, quite low, around $50 a barrel. If that remains the case for the next 2 or 3 years, Russia's going to have real problems at home, let alone now trying to support this new empire that Putin wants to put together. So we have time. Time is, in that sense, on our side. So I would offer him some opportunities to maybe engage in the manufacturing area, because Russia's not made the kind of decisions that China has made to allow foreign investment into Russia, to export the way China has exported. So we could offer some of these kinds of, incentives. And if he doesn't take it, fine. But at least we will be telling him, look, we're not out to, eliminate you or to push you completely out of Ukraine. We're looking for a way that we can stabilize the situation in Ukraine and maybe create an opportunity for peaceful competition. If the Russian way is the better way, it'll work its way out. If the Kiev way is the better way out, maybe that'll work its way out. In other words, stabilize the situation for some kind of a peaceful economic and political competition, like we did in effect during the Cold War.
Great, thank you.
Was there a first question I missed altogether?
Yeah.
Or
shorter one. How can we compromise with Putin?
Oh, okay, yeah. All right. Well, I think I answered that. Yeah.
Good. This one comes with a question about, I'll just read it. First world and third world and second world countries have populations with very different problems: medicine, clean water, food, etc. This largely boils down to a lack of infrastructure. How can we promote this growth in infrastructure so we can share the same problems and then share the solutions?
Oh, it's a good question, and one that's going to be with us for quite a while. I mean, there's still an awful lot of poor people in the world, and a lot of poor countries, and they suffer from some really horrible conditions. I mean, how easy it is for us to forget when we shower twice a day, and all the things that we're used to doing. So it really does take more and more effort, more and more money. But it's not the long run answer. Foreign aid is not the long run answer to any of these situations of poverty. The long run answer to these situations of poverty is to engage, get these countries involved in the global economy, to get them involved in trade and investment and innovation, creation of jobs, education, obviously, to support that. Let me just give you think about what's happened in the last 30 years. We have made more progress in the last 30 years towards creating a middle class out of poor people in the developing world than at any other period of history. Almost 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty into the middle class in China, in India, in Brazil, in Mexico. It's phenomenal what's been going on. For 30 years, those developing countries have been growing twice, sometimes 3 times as fast as the advanced countries. That means they have been becoming more equal, all right, with industrial countries. They have created a much better life for millions of their people. 300, 400, 500 million people in China today have lives that are much better than they were 25, 30 years ago. This has been done not by foreign aid, all right? Some foreign aid, obviously. It's been done, of course, by engaging those countries in the capitalist world economy. We wouldn't have a rich country without a capitalist system and without a capitalist market. At the same time, we need to think about how to position countries, all right, so that they could potentially someday become a part of the global economy. But let's say building a new port somewhere or building a new road somewhere, it's not going to be the answer until there are industries that are investing in that country and until there are activities, there are goods that need to be shipped on those roads and offloaded in those ports. I have a taxi driver who's from Nigeria that I use all the time when I travel. And he comes from southern Nigeria, and his family has quite a number of interests in southern Nigeria, especially farming interests. He tells me they wouldn't think of selling their products more than about 25 miles away for 2 reasons. They're great roads. They just happen to be completely unmaintained. They got huge holes in them, and they've, in some cases, slid off into the ravines. So you can't count on those roads being in good repair. Good infrastructure, but of no use. And then, of course, you said, we got the problem of brigands. We got the problem of pirates. We got the problem that our goods will be taken before we get to Lagos or wherever we may be going. So I think we focus sometimes too much on infrastructure without focusing on, we've built a lot of white elephants in that regard in the developing world over the last 50 years. We need to focus more on how to encourage the leadership, because this is a function of the policies of those countries, and corporations, our multinational corporations, how to find partnerships for these countries, to get them moving down the road of industrialization and real development, lasting development, sustained development, development that will maintain itself. In some sense, roads that will maintain themselves, because now they're being used quite often, and everybody contributes to maintaining them.
Thank you. As we transition to the end here, I thought you could help shed some light on what you would advise to the next president of the United States. So say the named president comes to you and says, Dr. Nau, I only have 2 minutes, but I'd really like to know what you would advise for me to do first things first in the next 90 days. What would you say?
Sounds like I'm talking to Dwight Eisenhower. Now I'm a little worried, and I'll be too long-winded. Look, I think the first problem we have to address if we're going to revive our leadership in the world and find a more sustainable way to stay engaged in the world is our economy and our debt, our fiscal problem. I think that's at the root of it. Ronald Reagan, when he came into office in 1980, he told us, or 1981, he told us point blank, we weren't going to accomplish anything else until we revived the American economy. By the way, we were running big deficits at that time, big compared to the past, nothing compared to what we have today. So I think until this domestic problem is resolved, I would put everything else on the back burner. But then I would have a strategy, a way of thinking about how I was going to use that revived economic leverage and what it would mean for my defense budget, and what it would mean for my relationship with allies, and what it would mean for my strategy for dealing with the autocratic powers, with the rogue states, with the terrorists. I'd have in mind, as Reagan did, we now know that he thought about this a lot, and he laid out most of this in writing long before he even came into office. He knew roughly, he knew in the broad directions where he wanted to go. But the first thing he knew, if that economic program didn't work, he wasn't going anywhere. 2 minutes?
Impressive. Eisenhower would have been pleased.
Yeah.
Please join me once again in thanking Dr. Nau.